gentlemen, and tarnished of all ages, overpowered builds come in all shapes and sizes, whether it be the height of one-shot capability from a damage standpoint, a space of unbelievable tankiness that makes it impossible to fail, or like the subject of today, a build that just abuses one specific game mechanic to frankly ludicrous degrees to make nearly any fight in the game way more comfortable than it is with most builds, and just let you fully control the flow. This, ladies and gentlemen, is Square Off. This is an Ash of War that can only be applied to short swords, and it is a stance-based skill, where specifically the R2 follow-up to entering the stance is a lunging forward thrust that not only counts as a thrusting attack, which activates the counter-attack mechanic to give you a bunch of bonus damage when you hit with it while an enemy is either mid-swing or has just finished attacking at you, but also this attack does a ton of damage and poise damage specifically, being one of the highest poise damage attacks in the game to the point that unless you have to wait in between, most bosses actually will be staggered by 3 uses of this skill's heavy attack follow-up. Of course, that doesn't always work perfectly. Sometimes it takes 4 just because you have to dodge combos here or there, or some time passes in between, but it is remarkably easy and consistent to get staggers quickly with this build, and that's on top of the damage of the skill being relatively high for how easy it is to use as well. And so the entire point of this build is finding any openings possible for the skill, staggering the boss in 3 to 4 hits of it, then you can do a power stance attack followed by a crit attack before they stand up, and then you can do another square off heavy as they are standing up to complete a full combo. Combined with the ways that we are building this, that means you just have a bit of buildup actually causing the stagger to begin with, but once the stagger happens, you are built to punish off of that window an extreme amount, and we have one of the strongest ways to apply stagger to begin with too. All that said, let's dive into the build, everything that you need and where to get it, with the caveat that I will of course be assuming that you know how to get everything involved that is from the base game. First up, the weapon. I did a fair amount of testing for different weapons at different stat break points for this on different affinities, all sorts of things like that, and the best overall sword and affinity for this build is broadsword set to heavy scaling. Ideally, your offhand weapon would also be a broadsword. There are plenty of straight swords that can fit the bill if you don't have a second one, but that is technically the best one. Interestingly as well, you can set the offhand broadsword to cold scaling, where still scales reasonably well with strength actually, but also gives you a way to apply frostbite buildup in any situation where you are just sort of swinging the weapon a bit more normally, which for the most part is honestly just general level clearing outside of a rare opportunity for a light attack mid-boss fight. As for why this doesn't lower our damage then, because you might be wondering, this Ash of War actually does the exact same damage whether you initiate it while one-handed or two-handed, regardless of the fact that we have it scaling with strength, with the logical explanation for this being that because visually the stance has you hold the weapon with 2 hands, it always counts it as being two-handed no matter what, so there is no loss at all in walking around with a second short sword for the power stance moveset. Outside of that, you want a seal, and the best one for our specific setup is the dryleaf seal. The reason being that it is the best faith scaling seal at our current faith, which is important because while the clawmark seal has higher incantation scaling in general, the only spell that we care about making more powerful is purely affected by the faith portion of your incant scaling. This is a new seal in the DLC then, and it's right over here just northeast of the Recluse River downstream side of Grace. If you wrap around here to the opposite side of the cliffs from where the Grace is, it is just sort of sitting on a ledge under some grave birds that you can drop down to. Then we have our armor, and for this you just want full Rakshasa armor if you want to min-max your damage, which is 8% damage total, 2% per piece. Otherwise, feel free to use any sort of fashion that you would like, or even go deeper into heavier poise armor to let you trade with this skill just a little bit more too. To get the Rakshasa armor set then, it is dropped from the boss of the Eastern Nameless Mausoleum, which is right near our last item as well from the same side of Grace. Here you instead want to parkour down the gravestones just 1 level, then follow along the cliff line and the river northeast, and if you do so, you will see the mausoleum pretty quickly. Past that, we have our talismans, and first up, of course, is the Shard of Alexander, a 15% bonus to weapon skill damage, which we are using a hell of a lot of. Then the Spear Talisman. This boosts the damage of all thrusting counterattacks by 15%. This is the mechanic that I talked about earlier, and this is why my opening hit on this Rellana fight does almost 10k. It can be quite hard to purposefully use this mechanic with this attack because you will just be tipped by enemies a lot of the time, but when it does line up, it just boosts the damage by such a nasty amount. Then we have the Blade of Mercy Talisman. This is new and increases all damage that you do by 20% for 20 seconds after hitting a critical hit, which we do relatively easily with our high poise damage weapon skill. This talisman comes from inside of the Scorched Ruins, right beside where you start the DLC, and specifically from this Grace here, you want to head back into the middle of the ruins, turn directly west to find this staircase leading up inside of this collapsed building, then just follow the stairs across to the roofs and then go across the roofs to find a door that you can open with a chest inside of it that has this talisman. Then in the final slot, it's a slight flex situation. Rellana's cameo will be more generally useful. This increases the damage that you deal by 15% with a stance-based attack after being in that stance for a couple of seconds, which means if you have an opening that is more than just a regular square-off heavy, but not quite big enough for 2 of them in a row, you can instead wait a beat before you use it and do only 1 of them, but with 15% more damage. This often specifically comes into play directly after a critical hit, as mentioned with the combo at the beginning. That said, this only takes effect a few times per boss fight. Honestly, it's definitely better for trash, but an alternative option for bosses is the Dagger Talisman for a 17% boost to critical hits themselves. Basically, the logic of this choice is if a boss has enough health that you'll stagger them more than once before killing them, and also has very few openings big enough for the cameo to actually activate, this will simply be a stronger choice, with a great example being Radahn, the final boss of the DLC, of course. Moving on from that, then, we have our Wondrous Flask of Physic, and inside of here we have the Blood-Sucking Cracked Tear for 20% more damage at the cost of health drain over time. And this is basically worth it if it makes a boss fight last 45 seconds or less. Anything longer than that and the damage intake that it does to you becomes much less ignorable, but it does tip a few bosses under that threshold in this setup specifically, so it's worth mentioning. To get this one, go to the Castle Watering Hole Site of Grace, climb up the ruins to the northwest side of the larger structure, and then throw a hefty furnace pot into the basket head of the downed furnace golem to bring it back to life. Hit 2 more of the same pot from the same place and it will instantly die. Then you get this reward when it does. Aside from this, the other 2 good upgrades for this are the Lightning Shrouding Cracked Tear, as we do a bit of lightning damage, and this boosts our lightning damage by 20%. It is far from our main damage type though, but it isn't negligible either. Then the third option, specifically for when blood sucking is too risky, or if a boss is just somewhat resistant to lightning damage, really, is the Stone Barb Cracked Tear for 30% bonus poise damage, but this only lasts for 30 seconds, which is relatively limiting. On most bosses though, this will let you get the 3-hit stagger extremely consistently, even if you have periods of dodging attacks in between, as long as all of them hit within that first 30 seconds. And on some of them, it will even turn it into a 2-hit stagger, which is pretty fantastic, especially as that often means that you can get more than one of these within that 30-second window and just trivialize a fight completely by stun-locking the boss for most of the fight. Following that, we have our spells, which are all buffs: Golden Vow for a 15% boost to all damage that you do, and a 10% boost to damage negation for 80 seconds after casting. Then also Flame Grant Me Strength for a 20% boost to your physical and fire damage for 30 seconds, and the vast majority of our damage is physical, so it gets boosted by that. The rest of it though is mostly lightning, because we also use Electrify Armament. This is simply because the weapon, while on heavy scaling, can have a weapon buff applied to it, so it would be a waste not to, and lightning is the most generally useful element in the DLC, as well as applying more bonus damage to the weapon than even the new heftier weapon Greases at our current faith and incantation scaling. Another option if a boss is particularly weak to holy damage specifically is Order's Blade. This scales just as hard as Electric Armament, but with holy damage instead of lightning, but it does require you to put a few more points into intelligence to use that I don't personally have set up for my skills. Then finally, for how to actually become what you see here, your actual stats and attribute layout from your level up points: 60 vigor just to keep you from being turned to paste by boss attacks. Then you want 20 endurance to actually be able to medium roll with our full setup. 54 strength puts you at the soft cap of strength while two-handing weapons. 27 faith is the minimum required for our seal. Then put 4 points into mind so you can cast all 3 of our buffs without needing a flask if you are using Radahn's Great Rune and it is active. Then you should have somewhere around 25 levels remaining depending on your starting class, and the best offensive use of this is just pumping them further into your strength stat. This puts us above the soft cap by a fair margin as far as the weapon skill is concerned, but it simply gains more damage from these levels than it does by putting the same levels into faith for the lightning scaling, and so it just sort of makes the most sense as to where to actually spend them. And with all that covered, then let's talk about how to play. It's honestly relatively simple. Just learn the patterns and openings during the boss's combos, then use the heavy version of the square off weapon skill until it causes a stagger. Sneak a power stance attack in, then get the crit, then do a longer held heavy square off as they stand back up for the rellanas cameo bonus. Then repeat this combo until the boss is dead. Some bosses may break it just a little bit. Midra, for example, will actually break out of his stagger animation if he takes any damage after going down, so you have to cut out the power stance attack for him. So there are just occasional adjustments like that, but they're honestly relatively minor. That just about does it for today then, everyone. Just a really solid build that lets you take a lot of the fights in the game and just script them. Some of them still take a bit more skill or effort, but for the most part, the reliability of these staggers, how frequently you get them, lets you have an immense amount of control over the flow of pretty much any fight. And while it might not kill an enemy in like 10 seconds, it makes the kills feel extremely comfortable. I hope you've all enjoyed this then, and I hope you enjoy using it for yourself if you try it out too. Like if you liked the video, subscribe to the notification bell for more, and most importantly, ladies and gentlemen, until next time, stay sweet. Josh, Cotton, and Hollow with the videos, dropping the humor like a hammer on your tippy toes, bringing entertainment on a daily arrangement to take our insanity and turn it into entertainment. Yes, I said entertainment twice, to reiterate that it is nice to look into your faces on a mostly daily basis when you let us in your homes to make the whole world a stage. Goodbye.